What you sacrificed is what saves you after narcissistic abuse. Most scapegoat survivors of narcissistic abuse struggle to know that they can safely experience themselves as they actually are. They've had to don a costume of being abhorrent to the people who they first met in life and tragically learned how dangerous it was to take off that costume. And I think the crux of recovery from being the scapegoat in a family structured around a parent's narcissism is experiencing a sense of safety in existing as you actually are without that costume. Well, what do I mean by a costume? There's a coercive, orchestrative, even theatrical element to the role of the scapegoat to the narcissistic parent. And as I've discussed in other videos, the narcissistic parent's personality pathology requires them to relocate their own deep sense of worthlessness into someone else over whom they have authority and can coerce that unfortunate soul to take on that worthlessness as their own. The narcissistic parent does this by conveying to the scapegoat child that the only reality available to share with that parent is for the child to be undeserving, defective, selfish, difficult to love, and blameworthy, while the parent is magnificent, kind, nurturing, and gentle. And by extension, this reality dictates that the narcissistic parent only abuses the scapegoat child because that child supposedly deserves this treatment. And most scapegoat children at one point or another have had to tell themselves, my parent wouldn't hurt me like this if I weren't so bad. So in order to enter into this role, the child in essence has to wear the costume of the scapegoat and maybe even forget that it's a costume and confuse the stitching on the costume for the child's own skin. But at some point in life, it becomes possible to notice that you have worn or are wearing the scapegoat costume. Then you get to see how much the costume masks, that there's so much to who you are that is totally at odds with the scapegoat costume. In fact, these features of you may have always seemed out of reach to you while in the costume. You may have looked at others who seem to be strong, dignified, or worthy of respect and love, only to see that you have had these traits all along. That's what's been ailing you all this time, is not that you had to figure out how to obtain these wanted traits. Instead, you realize that your suffering has come from having to tell yourself you don't have what you in fact possess because the costume just couldn't allow it. So you couldn't know that you were attractive because the costume said you were hideous. Or you couldn't know your own courage because the costume said you were a coward. Or you couldn't know your own dignity because the costume said you were of lower status. Well, in today's video, I'm going to describe the process of reclaiming what you had to sacrifice within yourself in order to play the role of the scapegoat. And this reclamation project is often met with deeply felt pangs of danger. And I'm going to offer some explanations of where that danger comes from and what you can do about it. And last, I'm going to describe a major shift in one's purpose for living that can occur when you have reclaimed your sense of safety in being your positive and strong self. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse, both in individual therapy and through my online course and the accompanying private Facebook group. Together, we undertake a process of recovery using a map to get to the survivor's new home within themselves and in new or in re-engineered relationships with safe others. And the map really contains 3 pillars of recovery that let the survivor know how they got here, where they want to go, and how to get there. And those translate, or the pillars translate to the first one being making sense of what happened so that you know it's not your fault, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, and whether that's psychological, emotional, or physical distance. And the third pillar is living in defiance of the narcissist rules for living. And lastly, you can't do this in a vacuum. I think it's essential to find and participate in communities of people who get you, validate you, and support you on this path. And that's where the accompanying private Facebook group comes in. So people in this course are not alone as they traverse the path back towards themselves. Well, today's video falls under the pillar of living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And you can learn more about my online course by finding the link in the description box below or by clicking here. And if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to hit the subscribe button and turn notifications on so that you're alerted when I post new videos on these kinds of topics. Recovery from narcissistic abuse can be confusing. I think for the scapegoat survivor, knowing that what might feel most dangerous is what feels good to know about yourself can be very orienting. I think that if you've had the misfortune of being scapegoated by a narcissistic parent, there are very real survival mechanisms in place that in essence refuse to believe that your own mother or father could be wrong in how they treated you. And as I've explained before in other videos, the child's psychological survival requires that he or she believes they have a parent who's willing to take care of them. And if that parent is frightening or hurtful towards the child, and there are no other viable adults to attach to, then that creates a problem that the child only has themselves to solve it with. And the way the child often solves this problem is by donning that costume of scapegoat as a narcissistic parent coercively insists, while denying that there's anything wrong with how the parent is treating them. Given these kinds of early circumstances, it stands to reason that becoming aware of your strengths as a person might very well feel dangerous. Crediting yourself with admirable traits would be at odds with the costume that used to ensure a very important form of survival. And yet, here you are, looking for a way to cure the inner sense of pain, muzzled agony, emptiness, and confusion that you might be feeling within. Well, one way to orient yourself in this is to play with the explanation that when you experience heightened bad feelings, check to see if you did or thought something that gave credit to who you are as a person. If you're a scapegoat survivor, then bad feelings may get triggered by good feelings about yourself. That sequence was exactly what let you survive earlier in life. And if you find that you tend to feel particularly bad after feeling good about yourself, that's sort of great because now you have identified a very fertile ground to work on in your recovery. Because I think with this awareness, you can work to notice the thoughts that might intervene between the good feelings and the bad feelings. So here's an example. Bruce was a writer who was in therapy after surviving a childhood where he was the scapegoat to a narcissistic mother who had to see Bruce as incapable and in need of her help at all costs. And Bruce learned that he had to appear feckless and confused if he started to build momentum in something he was doing, or she would have felt outdone by him and proceeded to viciously berate, undermine, and attack him for some made-up reason. Well, one session, Bruce reported that he had completed an entire chapter on the novel he was working on. And in the next session, he came in deflated and said he completely lost his mojo in the past week. His mind was scattered and he kept feeling distracted. His therapist inferred that it was his use of and acknowledgement of his actual prowess as a writer in the prior session that may have set off this bout of self-disparagement. So his therapist said, I wonder if something didn't feel quite right or maybe safe after you told me how well the writing was going last week. And Bruce said, well, what do you mean? Why wouldn't that feel safe? I was feeling good. And his therapist said, well, I know you were, but I also know that you had to figure out some pretty painful ways to contort yourself in the past so that you were seen as incapable or directionless and in need of being told what to do. That's a lot like the state you seem to find yourself in now. And Bruce said, yeah, you're right, but I don't know what to do about this. And his therapist said, well, acknowledging that this may be happening is a really important first step. It suggests that things could be otherwise because we're seeing how they're operating now. And as you think back on leaving session last week, can you pay attention to any thoughts you may have had about telling me about your success with the chapter? And Bruce goes, Well, I remember feeling some sort of dis-ease. It's hard to put into words, but something didn't quite feel right. Then I went home and tried to write more, and I was at a complete loss. This therapist says, yes, that dis-ease seems to have been a warning signal from your past that you were in dangerous territory. By demonstrating your competence, you were doing something that this part of you associates to losing someone you really needed at the time, and maybe also incurring their wrath. And Bruce said, yeah, I see that, but what can I do about it? And his therapist says, well, you can perhaps try to mimic what we're doing now. Paying attention to this part of you that's concerned about what will happen if you know your strengths, and offering that part of you your compassionate understanding, then providing the new information that you are safe now. You're in the clear. You get to write to your full potential without the reprisal you used to have to steel yourself for. Now, Bruce didn't sort of all of a sudden be able to write without these challenges sort of right away, but he was able to adopt this process of listening to these pangs of danger that would arise when he brandished aspects of who he was in his life and offered himself validation and compassion. Then he could remind himself that he was no longer dependent on his mother nor vulnerable to her attacks. And over time, and with a lot of patience and compassion towards himself, he got to experience longer and longer periods of sustained writing. And this translated to longer periods of connection to himself while feeling safe in doing so. And over the course of a few years, Bruce's main purpose shifted from avoiding the post-traumatic danger of being caught without the scapegoat costume in his life to experiencing the rewards of exercising his strengths as a person. That just grew to feel intrinsically meaningful and rewarding to him because it was now safe to experience. And I bring up this example because I think it highlights another key ingredient in knowing it's safe to reclaim what you had to sacrifice in order to play the role of scapegoat. The presence of a new relationship where the scapegoat costume is not necessary. Bruce's therapist had his best interests at heart and therefore would not want him to don the costume. Such relationships can also happen outside the therapy office, of course. What reclaiming your positive qualities looks like in life? Well, as illustrated with Bruce, when enough safety has been experienced in being your real and positive self, you may notice a shift to occur. What the scapegoat survivor was initially denied by his or her narcissistic parent becomes achievable, and that is the prospect of living to experience the first-hand meaning and gratification of being who you were meant to be in this world. So endeavors get undertaken because they feel aligned with who you know yourself to be, rather than solely as a means to the end of avoiding a post-traumatic danger. And I'm talking about this not to discount the value of every effort taken to get to this point, where such self-congruence is not yet safe to experience. But rather, I'm hoping that fleshing out what life can look like after this reclamation effort has taken root can really serve a hopeful function. Well, I hope today's video has been helpful about just this really, I think, critical point to know in your process of recovery, that it's the very things you had to, at one point, expunge from yourself, not know about yourself, that you eventually get to take in, utilize, and live from, that form the sort of solidity of a really strong recovery from this form of abuse. Well, thank you for your continued support and engagement with this channel. I would encourage everyone to continue submitting questions in the comments section that you'd like to see a video on, because I'll continue to create some videos based off of those. And I look forward to posting again next Friday. And in the meantime, I hope everyone is well and takes good care.